Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, depending where you are. Thank you for joining us for the virtual panel on the acceleration of digital trade, jointly organized by UNFIF and the National University of Singapore's Institute of South Asian Studies. Before we proceed, I would like to mention that there will be an opportunity to post your questions to the panelists by using the chat function on the GoToWebinar app, or you may simply send them to enquiries@onfif.org. This afternoon, we are delighted to have with us the following speakers and moderators to share their views on this topic. First, we have Madam Pinchana Wongkopon, who is the Director General from the Ministry of Commerce, Thailand. And then we have Bruce Gosper, he's the Australian High Commissioner based in Singapore from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, as well as Douglas Lippold, who is the Chief Trade Economist from HSBC. Joining them today in the discussions will be Dr. Karthik Nachapan, who is also the Research Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies. He will be the first respondent in this panel discussion. Without further ado, I would like to hand this over to Dr. Amitabh Palit, who is he is the Senior Research Fellow and Lead of Trade and Economics at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the NUS. Dr. Palit, please.
Thank you so much, Angelica, and let me take this opportunity to warmly welcome you all to this, what we are hoping to be extremely fascinating discussion and engagement on the subject of the acceleration of digital trade. We have already been introduced to the very distinguished set of panelists that we have here with us, who are going to give us a rather good chunk of issues to brainstorm and debate and discuss on as we dive deep into this subject. Now, let me just have the pleasure of saying very briefly a couple of words in the beginning. We have all been talking about this phrase, which by now has become almost cliched, that after the COVID-19, the world is not going to remain the same anymore. The world is going to experience a new normal. And I suppose all of us have our own individual positions and perspectives when we subscribe to this view. But on one subject, and there could be more other subjects, but at least when it comes to the question of digital trade, I think there is by and large near unanimity of the fact that the COVID-19 has created conditions and circumstances and contexts which very strongly emphasize the importance of digitalization, changing structures of various systems and processes in as digital a fashion as possible, so as to ensure that COVID-19 like situations in future do not create the kind of disruptions which they have in the system of cross-border exchange and movement of goods, services, people, thoughts, ideas, and even capital. Now, with that broad context at the back of our mind, and if we are indeed going to look to play bigger roles, whether we be businesses, whether we be policymakers, whether we be practitioners in a world which is going to experience much greater visibility and participation of digital actors in the system of international trade. What are the issues that we need to focus on? What are the challenges that we face in this regard? And what are the perspectives of countries as they look to embrace this particular reality? I think these are all questions which are very important for us to deliberate on, very important for us to reflect on. Maybe all of them will not be in a position to produce answers right now. These all could be evolving, and more elements and insights would be added to these questions and their responses as we go ahead. But in order to contribute to that effort of engagement and discussion, we are here with you all today, and thank you participants for joining us. We hope it will be an engaging, fruitful, and very useful session. With that, let me take the opportunity of inviting His Excellency Bruce Gosper to open the session by his initial remarks. Bruce, over to you. Unmute, please. Unmute.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to join you all this afternoon. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, Bruce, we can hear you. Please go ahead. Yeah.
You can hear me now?
Yeah,
Okay, good. Well, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to join you all this afternoon for I hope it's a fascinating discussion, because certainly very important topic for them. I think, as you noted at the outset, what we're dealing with is something which we've been working on for quite some time now. If one looks at the international trade architecture, if you look at the practices of businesses and the like, a lot of the issues that we're now confronting now have been with us for some time, but there's certainly a sense that they've accelerated and become more important. Issues like the infrastructure and bandwidth and telecommunication services, of skills and capability, inclusiveness of transformation, and even rules of the road. If we look a bit further down the track, how we equipped as a region in a global context to deal with some of these challenges, and more particularly, of course, the opportunities that the agenda offers. So we've been thinking about quite a bit. We've been with our businesses here in Singapore and elsewhere about the challenges that they're facing. Some have to say doing well. Anyone close to data, digital agenda, anyone in mix, anyone who has the right sort of business model, in particular business to consumer skills and involved in e-commerce and online sales, doing very well. And that's no surprise, given what's required with the environment in which we are now. And of course, as we all know, services were growing much faster than goods, and online services were growing as the fastest mode of services before the pandemic came along. And if anything, again, those trends have been accelerated. So we've got a particular context for some work that we've been doing, and it's particularly the economy agreement. Our Prime Minister's agreed late launch, and we just March this year, in a virtual summit, as it happened, our two Prime Ministers couldn't meet us because the pandemic had bitten into travel. So they had a virtual summit and agreed to conclude the DA. And now we're going through the process of just finalising text and those sorts of things. So we think it's probably quite an interesting agreement, because it's probably, at the moment at least, it's TPP plus, probably the most comprehensive and deep agreement of its sort. And it's not chapter in a trade agreement in its own right. Interesting. There's sort of three things.
I'm sorry, Bruce is breaking up a little bit.
One
Bruce,
is,
if I could just, Bruce, sorry, if I could interrupt you
was
for a
discussed by ministers.
Yeah.
And
Bruce,
the point
you are
is,
breaking off.
leadership
Sorry, Bruce,
of modern society.
Yeah. You are breaking off. Could you just check your connection, please? It's breaking off.
Yeah. Yes, we'll do that. In fact, you're breaking up as well. So maybe that's our connection.
Okay.
We're just seeing what we can do about that. Can you hear me at all?
Yeah. We can hear you. At least I can hear you.
It's all right now?
I can hear you 80% of the time. Sometimes you're cracking at some place. But please go on. Let's hope this will improve as we go. Hi, Bruce. I think you need to unmute. Bruce, we can't hear you.
Dr. Pali, would it be possible for us to move to the next speaker while maybe we can get Bruce to solve the connection?
That's okay. Can anybody just send a message to him, please?
We're just seeing if we can develop a better connection.
Okay, no worries. So can I then, Bruce, while waiting for you to, fix problems on that side, can I come to you, Douglas, and request you to have your space while we pick up on this theme and move ahead in terms of your views?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Very good.
Just turn
Okay.
this off.
Yeah, I
Well,
can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you very, very much for the invitation to participate in this session on digital trade. It's a subject that's very close to my heart. And I think it's quite astounding, the scale and the pace of growth we've seen in digital commerce. And it's growing due to increased connectivity in households, due to technological advances and e-commerce platforms, digitization of products and services. And in some ways, it's transformational in that you can have real-time consummation of transactions. But when I look at the UNCTAD data on the scale of digital trade, I realize that that we haven't gone far enough yet. According to UNCTAD in 2018, about 330 million individuals engaged in cross-border digital trade transactions. And when I see that, as a trade economist, I ask myself, well, where are the other 6.7 billion people? And when I see that some 404 billion dollars worth of cross-border B2C digital trade took place, according to UNCTAD, in 2018. I'm asking myself, well, what about the other $22.5 trillion worth of international trade? How much more of that could be digitized? And in short, what I'm saying is that we're still falling short of our potential. And we know that with trade, the basic economics are telling us that if we can reduce discrimination in the treatment of trade partners, if we can improve the ability of foreign suppliers to access markets, if we can establish a transparent, rules-based mechanism with appropriate protections for privacy and cybersecurity, and a format for recognition and authentication of signatures and invoices electronically, that we can greatly expedite, facilitate trade. And I have 4 areas in particular that I wanted to highlight, which have come up again and again in our reviews of the issue. First and foremost, I think that this issue of de minimis thresholds, when you're talking about B2C, business to consumer e-commerce, the treatment that a parcel receives at the border is quite important. There can be delays, there can be additional cost in terms of taxes that accrue. And so in some of the leading economies of the world, including Singapore, which has a de minimis threshold of nearly $300 US, we have parcels that are able to clear customs with expedited facilitation of the handling, in some cases duty-free, in some cases even consumption tax exempt up to a certain threshold. The US has a threshold of about $800, Australia as well, although Australia does impose a goods and services tax. But nonetheless, having a global regime that establishes a minimum de minimis threshold would be a way to facilitate expansion of e-commerce so that we can reap these benefits of trade, the standard type of trade benefits. The second thing I wanted to talk about quickly is that we have duty uncertainty. For the moment, there's a WTO regime that exempts digital transmissions from the levy of customs duties. But this is a temporary arrangement. It's an ad hoc arrangement that's been in place for over 10 years. Every 2 years, the WTO members convene to extend this, but there's an uncertainty. A supplier doesn't know if the next extension may not be granted. So this uncertainty could be addressed by making the regime of customs-free, duty-free treatment for digital transmissions permanent. That would incentivize further investment in this type of cross-border trade. The third area I wanted to highlight is an issue called data localization and restrictions on data transfer. These are two, in the digital era, as we digitize services delivery, for example, some nations have responded in part out of concerns, legitimate concerns about privacy, for example, or cybersecurity, have acted to restrict the ability of data managers to locate their servers where they best see fit. Russia, for example, in 2017 imposed a regime requiring data localization in Russia of certain files and limitations on the transfer of data, which denies consumers and businesses and governments of the benefits of big data to some extent. Now, we've got some ways to deal with this. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership has a very nice e-commerce chapter that imposes some disciplines on businesses for privacy, for cybersecurity, but also prohibits the undue limitations on transfer of data among countries that are participating. And then the last thing, so I think there's some work to be done here, and we've got other agreements that have looked at this as well. USMCA in North America, and the EU has some arrangements in this regard as well. So we can have a discussion about the options there, but it would be better to have a global solution. And then finally, the fourth issue I wanted to raise is just this issue of inclusive growth. We had a mention of this from Bruce earlier. I think this inclusive growth in trade, in digital trade, is very important. I mentioned in the outset that we have only about 330 million people that participated in cross-border digital trade in 2018. Where are the other 6.7 billion? Part of it has to do with access to the internet. I was looking at households. The UNCTAD reported that in Indonesia, only 40% of individuals are connected to the internet. In Thailand, it's 57%. So we need to get household access improved, but also business access. If you look across ASEAN, the OECD reports that small and medium-sized enterprises are often not online. In Cambodia, they note that only 13% of manufacturing enterprises have a web page in Cambodia. In the food sector in Indonesia, it's 15%. So I think there's more that can be done to have inclusive growth. You need to have people with access to the internet and businesses understanding how to use it. So I have two last points quickly I'll make. One is, I think the WTO initiative. There's a global negotiation underway right now. 80 countries, more than 80 countries are participating. They're trying to come up with a global framework to deal with many of these issues. And I'm optimistic. There's an economic incentive for each participant to have a deal at the end of this. It'll be a plurilateral deal. It won't be global. Not all members are participating, but I think it's a good starting point if we can achieve that. And the second thing is, if we don't get that, I would like to see regional trade agreements such as the CPTPP, such as the USMCA and others, Japan, EU, that agreement also has data provisions. The point here is it would be useful to see some convergence in the approaches so that we get at least an emerging global standard if we can achieve this at the level of the WTO. But I'm optimistic. I think the economic incentives are with us to get a global agreement at WTO. And many of the candidates for the new Director General post at WTO mentioned this actually during their conversations this week with the general public about their candidacies. So that gives me some hope there. And with that, I'll stop. I think I've used my time up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Douglas. In fact, I really thank you for outlining the issues that we have with us in the entire conversation very specifically, right from the level of multilateral challenges to the individual country level challenges and also thematic challenges. Thank you so much. We will have enough to come back to you and check back with you on as we go ahead. In the meantime, Bruce, can I come back to you now if you are able to hear me? I'm sure you're able to hear me now. And if you could kindly take, say, around 5 minutes to finish some of the broad points that you wanted to make, and we are going to come back to you again. Over to you, Bruce. Bruce, you need to unmute yourself. Unmute. Hi, Bruce, we can't hear you.
I'm unmuted.
Yeah.
So
now I can.
I am unmuted. Now
Yeah,
you can
okay,
hear
now
me. All right. There's obviously a delay. It's hard to imagine that there's a spot in that space where we're sandwiched between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the US Embassy, and the Chinese Embassy, but it does seem to be the case, at least this afternoon. So maybe something's going on that I don't know about. Anyway, I was talking a little bit about the Digital Economy Agreement, and just to make a few points. One is it's launched by leaders, and I think that's symptomatic of the fact that it matters not just to business. It's not just about digital trade. It's about how our societies work. It's about inclusion of citizens. It's about future growth and employment, all those sorts of things. Secondly, it looks ahead. So what we found was it's very hard for the regulators to get ahead of the technology. The world's changing very fast, and you can have basic principles of technological neutrality and interoperability, but you can't get ahead too far, and lots of things have yet to be developed. So we've developed not just concrete treaty-level commitments on things like data flows and localization, but a series of MOUs which actually look ahead. So on things like innovation, about having bilateral exchanges of data sets to experiment on things that will produce better outcomes for citizens, on artificial intelligence, on e-invoicing, on e-certification for agricultural trade, on trade facilitation, on data protection, on digital identity. We have separate working groups between our two economies, which will really look quite hard at where the technology is going, so that policymakers and regulators can try and think ahead about what sort of challenges and opportunities there will be in those sorts of areas. And that takes a lot of work. And then the other thing is we are thinking about not only looking ahead and looking deeper, but wider. We'll come to a discussion, I'm sure, on the trade architecture. I've already touched on it a little bit, but we see this because it builds on the TPP. The disciplines I spoke about actually go further than the TPP. We're both members of the TPP, and we see the possibility that other major economies could come on board, so that we can get some sort of coalescence around best practice, the appropriate approach on a whole range of issues, and promote cooperation and dialogue around these sorts of issues. And there's a multiplicity of forums and processes where we're talking about these sorts of issues. We'll come to that a little bit later. Indeed, we're seeing discussions, for instance, around the TP model with what we call like-minded countries, which I'm delighted to say included the US as well as some others. So, there's a lot of opportunity around these sorts of trade architectures, and we're working quite hard on that. But we'll come to that a little bit later. So maybe I can just leave my initial comments at that.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for actually, summarizing a specific but extremely important aspect of the move forward on digital trade, at least as far as the Asia Pacific is concerned. The CPTPP is likely to provide a very useful template, and there are important lessons to be learned from it, particularly as countries work together in building specific digital economy partnerships. We will come back to you with more queries on that. And may I now have the pleasure of inviting Madam Pimchano Wonkopon for your comments. Ma'am Wonkopon. Ma'am, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, I hope you can hear me now. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm not so sure that the seminar is supposed to be focusing more on the financial aspect because of the institute name is about finance. But anyway, I suppose we are here to talk about digital trade. But let me begin by going one step backward to look at quick to take a quick look at the impacts that COVID has brought upon trade and maybe economic issues in Thailand, in the region, and I believe in the world. I think there are about 6 major disruption or things that are we are experiencing as a result of COVID. And the first one is the change of supply chain. I think in Asia, at least, this has been very significant. We had disruption of supply chain from the impact of trade war 3 years ago, and now we have seen it being accelerated or heightened after COVID. And the impact of supply chain is not only having effects on export, but also on investment flow, from different country to go to different country, and from different sectors to new or more important sectors recently, such as healthcare and some other food production instead of a car, automobiles, for example. So from my perspective, changing supply chain is going to have very important implications on trade in the future. And secondly, and I don't need to elaborate much on this, we have seen growing trade protectionism, and also I don't want to call it nationalism or whatever, but anyway, people tend to look back into their country more, and this is a worrying trend as well. Particularly, we have seen emerging important terms like food security is not enough. We need now to have health security as well. In Thailand, we are looking at both terms as a very important basis for our future strategy. And thirdly, of course, the healthcare and health issues will become more important, as well as a social change. The social distancing is bringing about a changing in social. And then, so I'm coming to the 5th and 6th change, which are the topic of our discussion today, which is digital disruption and also digitalization of economic activities, as well as innovation. I think from my experience following this issue very closely, and we are supposed to talk about trading rules today, whether it will be able to catch up, whether we need new trade rules for the world post-COVID. And I have a 20 years background in trade negotiations, but I think if I'm here correctly, Ambassador said something like trading rules cannot follow reality quick enough, and that is precisely what I feel. After so many years, trying to negotiate something, and I think now the world is moving so fast that rules alone will not answer everything, and rules cannot catch up fast enough. But I'm not saying that rules would not be necessary. I would come back to this. There may be some rules that will be necessary in the future. But my first point is that I think in the future, cooperation, or at least get together and talk about certain key issues that will emerge after COVID is very important. Not less important than having new rules. That's my first point. The rules cannot follow development in technology and digital fast enough. And secondly is that I think we need to, the trade people need to look at the situation right now in terms of trade facilitation more than regulation. I think the COVID has impact on products and services, on supply chain, and also on customers' behavior. Some of the issues that affect all these three in the supply chain requires different things. I think the need for facilitation is more important because a lot of transactions in the digital world will be more private to private, which the government cannot touch much. But then, of course, there are at least 4 areas that I think the government may need to look at it in terms of regulation. You know, okay, facilitation is key, but there may be some necessity for certain regulations, such as the protection of consumers from fraud. I think that's very important. Digital economy will bring about more fraud, and we need to find some way to, do something on consumer protection. Second issue is the cyber security. I think this is very important. If everybody do a lot of transactions online and we have security problem, then it's not very good. Third one is the data privacy. I think people need to have data information should be protected. But on this issue, I'm not an expert. I don't know to what extent they should be protected. And I think in different countries, protection of data privacy differ from each other. So maybe we need to sit down and talk about what kind of protection is desirable, and that would not hamper trade, but at the same time protect consumer. And another area that I think the government needs to look at is competition. Maybe for Mr. Douglas, this comes in the terms in the areas of tax measures, but I think competition between I don't want to name names, but let's say big platform in Thailand is a big issue. Why do Thai people which use a lot of online e-commerce? They use almost 100% foreign platform. So we are losing not only tax revenue, but also information. And so there's been a call for the government in Thailand to create some kind of Thai platform, that so we can keep some revenue in our country as well as have access to data. But I think for me, tax is probably not the only option. I think maybe if we cannot get information from the big platform, probably we should talk to them about data sharing, for example, or some other options. This goes back to the issue of creating level playing field between domestic and foreign players. But my own personal view is that digital trade is very useful for SMEs. So I do not wish to see restrictions on digital trade. That's my basic position. But how to do it, to facilitate it in a way that would be beneficial to SMEs and to consumers. That is the thing that I have. And my last group of issue would be about rules and services. I was a services negotiator for 15 years and doing services, investment, e-commerce, as well as sustainable development, because environment was my first issue, so I love it. I continue with it. But my area is services. And for me, when we talk about CPTPP, which in Thailand is a big issue now, I don't know whether any of you knows, but it's a big, there's a big anti-CPTPP here in Thailand, on the issue of UPOF, the plant variety protection. It's no longer about medicine patent much, but now it has moved on to CPTPP will kill Thai farmers, that kind of stuff. Anyway, I think just go back to services, which is my area. I think services will see a lot of disruption from digital trade, digital and technological development, like mode 1. If you are familiar with services, in the mode 1 and mode 2 of services delivery is no longer, even though most countries have unbound commitments, meaning they don't put any restrictions for now, but they reserve the right to do so. I think technology has rendered mode 1 and mode 2 restriction almost impossible. And right now for mode 3 or investment, then because of digital development, I think there's much less need for mode 3 or business establishment in each country. But I think many countries will still require a local presence just to ensure that customers will be protected. For example, even e-payment, which is a key component of the future of digital trade. I think the Bank of Thailand is still thinking hard how much and how far they would keep the requirement on local presence to ensure that if the digital payment service coming to Thailand, then the shops that receive payment from foreign tourists, to make sure that the shop will receive money, that kind of stuff. So it's less important, but it's still necessary to protect some business entrepreneurs here. So in terms of rules, I think services will need to think a lot of whether you need to put on restriction or not, and in what form, because sometimes I think most of the services now you cannot put restriction on it, but you may need to do like on consumer protection and data protection, that kind of stuff. So to wrap up for this round, I think the trends that is going on digital trade development will be key for the future. And as I'm speaking from a developing country's perspective, I think it's very useful. I don't really want to see too much restriction put on it, but just necessary. And I think in the near future, we need to have a private sector or private lawyers talk about some extra territorial protection on issues like fraud, and also regionalization or localization, which is taking place now as a result of the supply chain. You may be able to play the role on creating some rules that will be beneficial to all the participants, the seller, buyer, consumers, and we not you, me, the government, regulator.
If I could please request you to kindly wrap up your comments.
That's my last sentence already. That we may need some regulation, but just to make sure that it is only necessary and do not hamper trade intentionally. That's my view. Particularly, we should look at ways to enhance cooperation for SMEs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ma'am Wonkopon. In fact, I think what you contributed in terms of the content of the challenges that the world faces, particularly the developing countries, is very, very significant. You alluded to the importance of rules being facilitated in a fashion that should help SMEs because they stand to benefit significantly out of it, which is an extremely valid point for pushing the crusade on digital trade. But at the same time, there are also these very serious challenges that you mentioned, particularly when it comes to services, when it comes to cross-border territorial management of issues in which probably extraterritorial law has to be crafted in a fashion that is practically acceptable. We will come back to all these and discuss at length, but might I now take the opportunity of inviting Dr. Karthik Nachiyappan, a research fellow from the Institute of South Asian Studies, as the first respondent to comment on this very illustrative and insightful narratives that we have listened to so far. Karthik?
Amithendu, thank you so much. And I'm very grateful to OMFIF, ISAS, and Amithendu for inviting me to provide some comments to an incredibly rich set of thoughts from our panel today. So what I'm going to do is bring some context and also to some of the issues that we've discussed around digital trade globally and regionally, and offer some thoughts on how these issues could be addressed given the rules we have and the rules we possibly need, directly responding to some of the issues that were raised by our panel. We are having this conversation now partly because of COVID and its impact on digital trade. But it's also important to keep in mind that this was already an accelerating trend before the pandemic. Digital trade is not in and of itself new. Digitally enabled transactions, be they in relation to goods or services, have been part of the landscape for many years and often raise the same or similar issues as non-digital transactions, like Madam Pimchinok mentioned. This is because digital trade is not just about digitally delivered services, but also about increased traditional, including supply chain, trade in goods and services that are enabled through growing digital connectivity. However, what is different now is that the scale of transactions, the emergence of new and disruptive players and business models that are transforming production processes and industries, including many that were previously less affected by globalization. I think the incentives to digitize have grown considerably across the region, which is now reflected in the volumes of trade, which was not the case before, and which could even go further, as Douglas pointed out. And I think one issue that does constrain digital trade is poor digital infrastructures across different parts of Asia, particularly countries like India, which have to upgrade their telecom apparatuses to allow for e-commerce to flourish more. And I think debates related to 5G acquire particular importance here because of substandard internet conditions in many countries. Second, digital trade barriers, like digital taxation and policies like data localization, which Douglas pointed on, are driven, I argue, by political economy issues in most countries, coupled with the constraining effects of adequacy agreements abroad. Now, if you look at the levels of digital trade globally, cross-border data flows have increased 45 times between 2005 and 2014, generating nearly $3 trillion in economic value. And most of these gains, I suspect, went to American tech firms. So policies like data localization have emerged across the world, in China, in Russia, Indonesia, Brazil, and most notably in India, to check and reverse this trend. I think all these countries are trying to exert greater control over technology nationally to counter the growing clout of the United States and their tech firms, particularly when it comes to generating profits through data collected from citizens abroad. And I think going ahead, we need to understand and unpack the political economy around technology in these countries to see whether digital barriers will rise as we deal with COVID-19. And I suspect that as different economies try to recover, some semblance of these barriers will exist and continue despite expected pushback from the United States. And you see this playing out today between the United States and India, when New Delhi levied a 2% tax on sales made by foreign e-commerce firms in the country. Now, tax collection all across the world has fallen, largely because of reductions in economic activity, which has increased physical pressures on governments to find new sources of revenue. And I think digital service providers will definitely be a clear target here going forward. So given the fractious politics and the political economy around digital trade that has become more polarized due to COVID-19, I think it could be difficult to expect or rely on the World Trade Organization to resolve most of these conflicts. Existing WTO rules and agreements that cover digital trade, but there are a number of questions around how well adapted current frameworks are to the new realities of digital trade. Now, larger countries, particularly those with considerable leverage and clout, will prefer to sort these questions out through plurilateral agreements, which the High Commissioner and Douglas pointed out. With countries that or with other countries that includes some of their closest trading partners. And this is what the United States tried to do with the TPP in 2017. The TPP contained restrictions on cross-border data flows, data localization requirements, and other barriers to digital trade, with obligations strewn in to promote the digital economy. If you look at digital taxation today, the OECD has been trying to head off a proliferation of different global tax regimes, and has been leading negotiations that allow countries to tax certain digital service providers, even if they lack physical operations in their own borders. Now, the US, along with its tech industry, has been eager to prevent a proliferation of new digital taxes across the world, and has pushed for a global tax regime that could govern all OECD countries. And it's be interesting to see how that extends further in the current negotiations. I think the conflicts and gaps emerging from digital trade will likely be resolved through the bilateral, regional, and the plurilateral fora, as has been mentioned by some of our panelists today, and not the larger, multilateral one. Some of that could be through standards on issues like fraud that Madam Pimchnok mentioned, data, cybersecurity, taxation, competition, and the environment. And these standards and rules could be easier to negotiate plurilaterally, not multilaterally. And turning away from the multilateral WTO process could also help here, because we need approaches that are more holistic, spanning both goods, services, and digital connectivity, and approaches that involve more stakeholders, including government, but also civil society and the business community, and approaches that are informed by the interests of a range of countries at different levels of development, just like what Pimchnok mentioned. So I will end my comments there, and I look forward to talking about the other aspects, particularly even relating to health data in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Karthik, for taking us through this very interesting compass of issues which are going to agitate the conversation around digital trade right now and in the months and years to come. And I would like to come back to our panelists, two of them, Bruce and Madam Wonkopon, respectively. On one of the points or the moot point that you made in your arguments, Karthik, that there is this overriding question of the political economy that remains central to all movements that countries and regions think of when it comes to not just digital trade, but any kind of collective movement on trade. We have seen political economy being very central. I'm actually surprised that in this entire conversation till now, we did not have a single mention of the RCEP, though we are talking about it in the Asia Pacific region. I'm not sure if we have already given up on the RCEP as a lost cause, but we did hear extensive consultations on the CPTPP. But let's try to go back to the drawing board and look at WTO. And the point that I'd like to check out from you, Bruce, is that you've also been a diplomat. You've seen how the political economy shapes. WTO ultimately matters in a significant way on going forward. When there is an agreement between a chosen few, essentially the bigger ones, the large countries, the US, India, China, European Union, maybe Japan. Now, what we see right now in the world is a very peculiar, fragile state of political relationship and status quo between these, major powers, large powers, some of the middle powers, who ultimately become very important in pushing the WTO agenda forward. And WTO has a low baseline when it comes to questions like digital trade, even when it comes to the subjects of facilitation around digital trade, which Mme. Wonkopon referred to. There needs to be a consensus among these countries. Now, do you think, my specific question would be that, do you think the current state of political economy in the world is conducive for the WTO to at all play a substantive role in taking forward the agenda of digital trade? I'd like to hear this from you, Bruce.
Sure, thank you. And let me just double check that you can hear me okay.
I can hear you very well,
Okay.
Bruce. I can hear you very well. Yeah.
Good, good. Well, look, the first thing, I'd agree very much with Karthik's point about a temptation on the part of some to take overly nationalistic approaches, and we mustn't forget that a less global world is a poorer world. That said, just looking at the definitional question of digital trade, and even from the discussion so far, we're describing it in a very large way. It's not just the specific trade rules that the WTO administers, it's much wider than that. So to make the point that there is no trade bureaucracy on the planet which has competence or the authority to deal with the wide range of issues that we've talked about thus far, nor is the WTO able itself to handle all the issues that we've identified. It's remit, a quite important one, and it's hinged on many issues that are relevant to digital trade. In its existing architecture, in the GATS agreement, for instance, in the trade facilitation agreement, in the work that's been done on the information technology agreement, all of those pieces of work are quite important. And of course, it started e-commerce negotiations. Now that's an initiative that was prosecuted by Australia, Singapore, and Japan. So quite an interesting group of countries, particularly this part of the world. And I must say that although the WTO unfortunately has had such a difficult time in the last decade or so, this is one area of negotiations where it has very good participation and support. And I say that because I'm now already the countries that are engaged in the e-commerce negotiations are the majority of world trade, if not of members. And I read the reports, I see the discussions that we're helping lead, and I see the positive approaches that the US puts on the table, that China puts on the table, that the EU puts on the table, that Japan puts on the table. So that tells me something, right? People recognize, countries recognize that there is actually an interest in having some rules of the road, some international standards or protocols in relation to digital trade. So that's a very positive thing, but a long way to go. And there's no doubt we're going to encounter issues which are pretty difficult and which touch on some of the geopolitical forces that you've described. There's no doubt they're in front of us. If I look at the issues that the WTO is dealing with, maybe fisheries, one or two other issues, but e-commerce certainly an issue which has occupied a great deal of attention in the WTO. I don't think the WTO itself is going to solve every issue, but it's not possible for one institution to do that. But WIPO has protocols. You've got with its codes that are relevant to the internet. You've got work being done in the G20 and the OECD on taxation, in places like the Global Innovation Forum, in the WEF on data flows, in APEC, which is quite important, on the digital economy. All these institutions and many others, I think, are sort of contributing in ways to understanding, to inclusion, to best practice, to develop the modalities for the way digital trade can develop the way businesses and societies interact with it. So all of that's in, and we need to sort of engage with all of that as best we can. The most important thing here is, as I said at the outset, a less global world is a poorer world. And the digital agenda offers immense opportunities for our economies and our societies. But we need to have an approach which is global, which gives the necessary transparency and predictability, and that's best done through cooperation and dialogue in international institutions of one sort or another. And I think there's a great opportunity in this part of the world to actually set some good practice in that. We've already referred to the TPP, but there are other agreements as well. I mean, we're coming up to the negotiation of the renegotiation again of the Australia-New Zealand ASEAN agreement. And that's already pretty good, but it can certainly be further enhanced in all sorts of areas. There's work that we're talking about with others, Korea and Japan, the United States and others. There's the TPP itself, and Thailand would be a terrific country to join the TPP. So maybe we can take that as one result of the discussion this afternoon. So there's lots of work to be done in various formats on various parts of the digital trade agenda, and it's really something where countries like some of the ones we've mentioned, Australia, Singapore, New Zealand, Vietnam, Korea, need to actually engage actively in and not get sort of trapped by purely what the majors want in this particular area.
Thank you on that, Bruce. And let me now come back to Madam Vongkopon. Madam Vongkopon, we have heard Bruce's perspective on this question, and it is clear that, as he explained very clearly, that the WTO obviously is not in a position to address everything. The WTO can probably only look forward to achieving, given its structure and the overall international political economy, it can probably only expect to achieve limited outcomes over a broad range of issues. But I wanted to come to you specifically, if you don't mind my asking so. Bruce mentioned about the CPTPP and the fact that it indeed has an advanced digital trade agenda, something which is a template for the region. I wanted to take you back to the other agreement that the region is negotiating, which Thailand is a part of, which Australia is a part of, and that is the RCEP. Now, would you really think that from the perspective of digital trade, the RCEP is a much less useful vehicle and architecture for a number of countries as opposed to CPTPP? And so, if it is digital trade that gets to be the decider, might countries want to lock on to CPTPP more as opposed to the RCEP, including some of the ASEAN countries?
Yes, thank you very much for the difficult question. First of all, let me touch on the work of the WTO first, and I think as Mr. Douglas has pointed out, the WTO has the moratorium, which I don't want to say this, but I was there in Geneva when it was agreed, so it was early 2000 something. I was in Geneva as a junior officer from 1999 to 2003, and the moratorium was set just before I left, I think. So it has, you know, those days when we talk about e-commerce in the WTO, it was only about downloading computer program or songs. That's all that was happening at that time. So the moratorium that Douglas mentioned was a moratorium not to impose tax on those digital content. It's not on digital trade or transaction as a whole. So I think WTO current regime on the digital on the e-commerce moratorium is is useful, but it still is a bit outdated now because the world has moved on a lot. But having said that what he mentioned that it could be made permanent. I think that this has been discussed for quite some time now, but some developing and least developed countries are still not quite sure whether they would be agreeable on not to impose a tax on some of the digital content. So we need to see that. I think they will just talk about this 2 days ago. I saw my friend, the ambassador, was talking about this. She called us. Anyway, there's another aspect at the WTO that I think is quite useful. And frankly, I have forgotten that the WTO has this agreement, which is the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, or the TFA. I think this, while it is not digital trade agreement as such, it has many provisions that would be useful if it is enforced, faithfully, so to speak. It will help facilitate digital trade in the future quite a lot. I read the report of the WTO that the TFA has many provisions that would promote the adoption of improved export, import, and transit procedures, which would enable transactions done by digital as well, by digital trade as well. So I think this is another good agreement that we should not forget when we look at WTO for their support on the development of digital trade in the future. And of course, there's a provision on the minimis that Douglas has mentioned in here that maybe it is an issue that can be discussed, but I'm not sure that we can agree in the WTO, so that is another good point. The other things that the WTO has that will be useful is the TBT and SPS agreement, but these are for notifications of measures. So to answer your questions, Professor, if we are talking about agreement on something very substantial, I'm not quite sure that the political economy at the WTO will allow it at this stage, although because of its global members, the WTO can be a place where you can discuss or provide technical knowledge and assistance to lesser developed countries, to understand the benefit and of digital trade, and that they should liberalize certain infrastructure and the ecosystem for digital trade. I think many developing countries are still ambivalent of the liberalization, or at least opening up their basic infrastructure like communication or telecom service, which is a key component for the good and it's important for digital trade in the future. So there may be some room for WTO to work, to educate, or to provide assistance for developing countries to understand the implications and how much digital trade open regime. I will not say completely open. I'm not the one for completely open everything. Opening or liberalization can have conditions. That's always my position. Although I think in the world of digital and technological development, it's almost impossible to put restriction on it. So second question on regional agreement. I must confess that I don't follow the regional agreement aspect on digital trade closely, because right now in Thailand we are more preoccupied with the plant variety issue, the intellectual property more. So I've been looking at that. It might be easier for countries in the region, particularly in the Asia Pacific, which of course include Australia and India, who are members of Rcep, to agree to certain basic principles in there. But I think my personal impression is that because Rcep has three other big major countries, China, Japan, and India, who do not have same positions on some key issues. I'm not sure that it might be they will be able to agree on some commitments that are of liberalization in nature. Okay, put it easier. The three major countries, if they have to liberalize or opening something on digital trade, even the data, which we were talking about. Mr. Kartik was talking about data localization. Will Alibaba, if I can mention name, will Alibaba be happy to share information on the consumers with other players in the region? I'm not sure about that. And for Alibaba, they would say that they are private companies. So even if the governments agree on something on the data issue, I'm not so sure that it will be applied unconditionally, with the private sector. But having said that, I do believe that there is a better chance of getting at least a clearer understanding among regional groups such as RCEP or I don't know about CPTPP, because I think CPTPP is the agreement is that has been agreed. So right now the negotiation will focus on the reservations rather than liberalization of the text. But it's a good option to try out, see what kind of cooperation you can do for the future. The future world is not the same. I was a negotiator with Thailand and US. I was the most difficult thing in my life. I don't want to do that again. USDR was not somebody to to mess with. But I think even with that, the world has moved on. There are new issues that we have to think about in terms of the digital and digitalization of world economy. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. That was, I would say, very candid, very forthright, and very
I'm
summative.
always candid. I'm always candid if I can. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for being candid with us in this forum as well. Doug, if I could now come back to you on a couple of points which you made, which Karthik also alluded to, and which has come back to us repeatedly, back to back. And there are a couple of questions which I have with me from the participants, which I wanted to bring into this. We are talking about digital trade and the importance of it flourishing, becoming as expansive as possible. But at the same time, there's probably what I can define as creative protectionism, which is coming up and which is kind of beginning to become rather obvious when countries take to expanding digital trade. And this is probably because a number of regulatory issues have in the meantime surfaced, exclusive of digital trade and the progress that it has made. So, for example, you alluded to data localization as one of the extremely important challenges that countries and regions encounter when it comes to digital trade. Looking at the Asia Pacific, do you think that, let's say, the cross-border privacy rules, as we refer to them, the CBPR, is something which countries can lock on to as a mechanism for facilitating cross-border flow of data with adequate sensitivity towards privacy and contribute to the cause of digital trade? Doug?
Right. Yeah, I guess to come back to the WTO as a starting point, I mean, the way I look at it, the WTO is an inclusive body. You've got the vast majority of global trade engaged through the members of the WTO. If we can use the WTO to establish some baseline rules agreed among the membership, that can provide a basic framework. And it's important because smaller countries have an equal say in principle. There's one country, one vote in the WTO. And there's a means of adjudicating disputes. Now it's troubled, it needs reform, but there's something to this principle. Now, I also am a supporter of regional trade agreements. I believe that countries in a region, such as the Asia Pacific, they may have a degree of like-mindedness that you may not find in the global community. They, in cases where countries are in proximity, they may have a greater incentive to work through the issues and to go farther than we can achieve at the global level. The gravity equation in trade tells us that, even services are traded most intensively between countries that are in proximity. Now, and we've seen this in the trade data that intra-Asian trade flows have increased, and trade with distant economies as a proportion of the total has declined marginally. It's a marginal change. So what I'm saying is the two levels can be complementary. But if you look, I was just reading through, as one does, light reading of chapter 14 of the CPTPP. If you look at how far this agreement has gone, the types of issues it's covered, many of the issues that are popping up here were considered by the negotiators. And I think this is an important starting point. I made just a quick list. You've got duty-free treatment for digital trade. You've got provisions for consultative governance. Stakeholders are to be consulted in the development of new regulations with respect to e-commerce. There's facilitation of trade through recognition of e-signatures, for example, or e-invoices. There's consumer protection. There's a legal protection required for personal information. There's clarity on what it takes. There's provision requiring clear regulation and guidance for businesses on what it takes to be compliant. There's an agreement that there should be best efforts to keep the regulatory information available online in a digital format so that others can access guidance on what they should be doing. There's yes, there is this requirement that cross-border data be permitted to flow, but it's subject to these provisions on cybersecurity, on requirement for national law on privacy, provisions on spam protection, limitations on data localization, all these issues. So that's an indication that countries like-minded have come together and gone farther. So that's one thing. The other thing I'd like to highlight for Asia, I think it's not just the US tech firms that are dictating this. Madam Pinchanok mentioned a Chinese supplier. And indeed, when you look at the UNCTAD data on the leading firms in the world that are engaged in this, yes, the US is heavily represented, no doubt, but China as well. And in fact, if you look, there's a Chinese venture capitalist, Kai-Fu Lee, who wrote a book called AI Superpowers that was on the bestseller list last year. And he's highlighting that Chinese firms have actually, in this environment in China, have been able to collect data. The original pioneering work on artificial intelligence and data may have been done in the US tech firms, but the Chinese enterprises now are increasingly implementing this. And they're building massive data sets, and they're able to leverage and roll this out. And my point here is that you've got these major players coming on. There's others. India, of course, is widely engaged in this technology space as well, with some prowess and some global players. And so I think it's in the interest of countries in this region to look at this and to think, okay, we've got multiple players entering the field. There's scale economies here that give these large players some advantage. It's better to have the baseline terms on privacy, on cybersecurity, on access to data, and these other issues, taxation we mentioned, set out now, while so that we can have some convergence and growth that's in a win-win kind of a structure. So,
Douglas, that's very interesting to hear, but I would actually want Karthik to come in back as a respondent to some of your comments. Karthik, particularly this question about the tech firms and the kind of turf battles they're engaging in the larger regional digital economy space. And When we particularly look at a country like India, for example, as Douglas mentioned, enormous capacities in some latent way, but probably skimming the surface on regulations, tentative on the steps to be taken in getting integrated with broader frameworks. Would you like to respond to Douglas's comments in this context?
Yeah, I hope you can hear me now.
Yep.
Yeah, great. No, sorry, I missed the importance of Chinese tech firms. And I think they are increasingly a big part of discussions around digital trade and data. And you see this unfolding in India, but also in other countries across the Asia Pacific. But I think at least I mean, if I just focus on India for a second, and what's been happening there with respect to the data localization debates, compared to the Chinese companies who deal with different forms and kinds of localization at home, they were willing to comply with the regulations and rules that the Indian government was intent on setting, particularly when it comes to storing, copies of personal sensitive data within India. It was the American companies, the Amazons, the Googles, and the Facebooks that really ramped up the pressures to the government and to change the focus and the policies vis-a-vis localization. And this has been an ongoing trend, not just on data issues, but also on other broad tech issues. Right? And you see the United States, and you see the tech companies in the United States raising and more willing to use the United States government and US law to compel other countries to comply with the rules and provisions that American law dictates on issues like trade, data, social media, so on and so forth. And this is connected to another issue that I wanted to just briefly come back to, is that, and this is, this is one way of how I am sort of looking at trade these days, is compared to how trade was, during the Uruguay round and even before that, is the diminishing or the space being given to development issues, on trade, and the willingness of big powers, major powers, to use their economic relationships and interdependence as a way to compel other countries to make domestic regulatory changes to keep trading relationships afloat with each other. So that sense of power is a big part of the political economy aspects that I was referring to earlier. And bigger powers are willing to use their clout and leverage and power to negotiate trade rules that suit their economies, their industries, and their companies more than ever. And this is more manageable, not in the multilateral setting, especially in the WTO, where development issues have found considerable and great salience over the decades. And it's much more amenable to do that within plurilateral and regional environments, where the bigger powers are able to use, again, their economic relationship and their interdependence to devise rules with their trading partners in their favor. And that is happening. That's happened over the last 10 years. And I expect that to continue going forward in the future.
Thank you, Karthik. I think that's a very, I would say, very relevant and at the same time a seriously daunting proposition, because I think to a very large extent, whatever conversations that we have today on any element of trade, and more so digital trade, the concept of the geopolitical relationships and the way powers view their own spaces within the arena of digital trade continues to remain very predominant. And that unfortunately might just, if I could loosely use the term, mess up the progress in certain areas. And I think, Bruce, to come back to what you alluded to, I think the relevance of bilateral partnerships and regional spaces in this regard actually become very important. So even for an organization like the APEC, looking at voluntary liberalization to take forward the agenda of digital trade might not be as fruitful as it was with the more conventional parts of trade earlier. Friends, I'm mindful of the fact that we just have around 8-9 minutes to go for this very fascinating conversation that we have been having. What I'd like to do is that I'd like to come back to our three panelists to utilize the minutes that we have with a specific context in which I'd like to sort of kind of ask them to give their final words. And that is the context of the COVID-19. You know, we began with COVID-19 and the fact that the COVID-19 has been a great contributor in many respects to the acceptance of digital trade across the region, across the world. But if there are a couple of areas that you really want to flesh out in terms of what do you think the COVID-19 has done or will do in boosting digital trade in future, are there a couple of areas that you'd like to point out? And can I start with you, Douglas, come to Bruce, and then end with Ma'am Wonkapon?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, well, we're in a very difficult situation now. We've had this significant hit to the global economy. First, production in Asia being disrupted, then demand in the West, in Europe and in the US, and now increasingly in Latin America and parts of Africa as well. So we've had a sequencing problem where even as Asia begins to manage and come out of lockdown and ramp up production, so there's been there's a lack of synchronization in return to the market. And I think we're going to be going forward into 2021, even if lockdowns ease, with something like perhaps a 90% economy is one way of putting it, where we're not back to full potential. And I think e-commerce, as consumers are exhibiting, even with the lockdowns easing, consumers are exhibiting reticence to come back in. They've had a shock. Many are unemployed. They're conserving. Savings rates have been rising in some economies. So e-commerce is providing a measure of security. Consumers can enter the market. They can purchase goods and services in a secure environment. And this may have some advantages. You know, it may play a role. And I see policymakers, they're looking for sources of stimulus for the economy. Trade agreements are clearly on the agenda as one way to do this. And I think that, you know, that digital trade will be a way that this can be unlocked. And in this regard, just quickly, I wanted to mention, I think we should keep in mind that some of these regional groupings, the ASEAN 10 or the CPTPP 11, don't include the EU or the US or China. And these groupings actually have scale. CPTPP represents $10 trillion of GDP. ASEAN is approaching 7 trillion. So these are large enough to carry some clout and to have some leverage, I think, these groupings of like-minded countries or similar-minded countries have some clout in this dialogue with the major players that I think we shouldn't underestimate. You know, there's force. I'm an American. I see when I consult with businesses in the U.S., there's interest in the CPTPP. You know, there's going to be some leverage among the CPTPP 11 if the U.S. wishes to rejoin. And I think that kind of counterbalancing leverage may be useful going forward as we consider digital trade in the context of negotiations. So
thank you so much, Douglas. Bruce, if I could now come back to you for your thoughts on how COVID will actually enhance digital trade. And if I could very specifically check with you, if you see a possibility of countries working out an arrangement for cross-border transfer of health data?
Thank you. And us is interested in the TD, I'm sure we'd be happy to sit down with them and have a chat. If they can match the requisite standards, then that would be a good discussion, I'm sure. Look, I think COVID has come along, and it's sort of combined with a whole lot of other things that are happening. The sort of wave of technological change of the last few years, of course, populism and a response to globalization, geopolitical shifts, and it's sort of quite interesting how just 5 or 6 months can sort of do a slight shift to attitudes and approaches that are quite a challenge and opportunity. And the two that sort of strike me as being quite interesting is how governments relate to this, how governments can provide service in a different way that meet the expectations of communities. So things that play into that include inequality, regional areas, those sorts of things. And I think health is a particular part of that. Now, we've got a good health system in Australia, but it's certainly the case that e-health and telehealth are growing very rapidly and changing things like aged care, where you might provide aged care in the future, how housing developments have done, how you configure city centres and the like. So those are all interesting things that I think are quite some challenges where we actually talk with the Koreans in the context of DEA about such. Most of the things we do is how we can exchange animal set data in areas like health, so we can look at what that data shows. We can provide better services. Is one example. We talk ethics. Data exchange, you know, how we should operate. It's the hardest thing, not the technology. It's often the ethics and governance of these sorts of issues which is the hardest. So I think big opportunities for government, big challenges, and getting that right, I think, is a really important thing for the cohesiveness of our societies. The other part of it is I watch with interest how businesses are accelerating their plans and looking at their business models and the like. So the opportunity for productivity enhancement. So a lot of our societies, a lot of our business sectors are struggling with, and you see the way it's sort of unlocking opportunities for that merge. And that's a very important thing globally. To actually get, I think people have long looked for where's the productivity enhancement from waves of technology, and maybe there's something here now when we look at the way businesses operate differently. Businesses have to deal more with the B2C element, not just the B2B, in the way supply chains can operate more smoothly, in all those sorts of issues. So maybe there's some important productivity gains that they're going to come from that front. So I think those two things that appeal most particularly as consequences of what we're going through. I'm not sure if that answers your specific question.
No, thank you, Bruce. I think you did allude to possibilities, which I think are the most important takeaways that we can have at this stage. I'm afraid I think we have lost the link with Ma'am Wonkopon at this stage. We probably are not able to reconnect to her. And oh, ma'am, okay, ma'am, we can see you, but if we could have very quick comments from you, we are already beyond 5:30. So maybe if you could just take a minute or two to give your final thoughts on how you might think COVID can accelerate the digital trade process.
Yes, thank you very much. I was here, just that my computer told me that I should turn off the video to because of the signal. Just quickly to answer your question, Professor, COVID, I think as Mr. Kati has said, digital trade has been here for a long time, but in my view, I think COVID has definitely accelerated digital trade. I will turn off the audio because everybody is frozen in my screen right now. So if you just hear me, yeah, okay. I just give you an example of what happened in Thailand after COVID. In the first 5 months of this year, we have seen traffic of wholesale retail activity in Thailand increase by 19% from last year. And now it accounts for about, we think that it will account for about 0.8% of our GDP. But having said that, it has grown quite a lot in Thailand, but Thailand still has only about 3% of our retail trade done online, you know, compared with 25% in China or 22% in the UK and 11% in the US. So in Thailand, we have a lot of room to expand the online and digital transaction. But this figure, it doesn't include tourism-related digital transactions such as hotel and air ticket and digital content. You know, if we include that, I'm sure it will grow so fast. I think it will definitely increase and accelerate the digital trade at the COVID. But my last point would be that, as I said, I see the development of digital trade very, very beneficial for developing countries. But we are not operating on level playing field, so to speak, like the social media that dominates transaction in Thailand and are either owned by US companies or Japanese or Chinese companies. So that sometimes we don't feel that operators or business owners in Thailand are given equal opportunity to be on the marketplace or on the platform. My final keyword that I want to leave is that the platform economy is going to replace many forms of business transactions in the future. So we tend to look at it in that way. But definitely there are lots to talk about on digital trade development. So this is just the first day. I hope that, yeah.
Thank you so much, Ma'am Wonkapon. In fact, I really think that digital trade and the conversation that we had today is just the beginning in terms of we beginning to scratch the surface and explore what are the various ways in which this particular entity is going to take shape, flourish, expand, or not able to expand to the way we think it might actually do and the kind of challenges that it faces. And in fact, there are a number of issues that we have discussed today which by themselves are actually subjects of exclusive discussions, including the matters of trade, e-commerce, then the question of trade facilitation, and even digital currencies, which we briefly alluded to but couldn't discuss in comprehension. Friends, I won't take more of your time. I am left to thank you, the panelists and the first respondent, Dr. Karthik Nachiappan. Thank you so much for your time and presence and contribution to the narrative. For me personally, and on behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, this was the first time we collaborated with the OMFIF in bringing this event to you. And we think that we have started off on a very good and positive note. We will continue having these conversations in the weeks and months to come. Please join us again. And I take this opportunity to wish you all a very good evening. Take care, stay safe, and see you soon again virtually. Thank you so much.